So, Sparky,
Yes, dear.
you want to read again to the kids?
Sure. So, we're back with the Bavarian Airship Regatta. And Drake and McTrowell, with the assistance of Jonathan Lord Ashley, have just captured one of those crawlers in E-Pact. So what happens next? Ooh, the next chapter is Victor and Vanquished. Okay, that sounds like there's going to be some action in there. Okay. And they're in the cabriolet on the way to the airship port, right?
Mm-hmm.
Very good. They rode in relative silence for a few blocks, each exhausted and a little disappointed in his or her own way. Sparky was looking forward to getting back to the Birkenhair, if only to get out of the uncomfortable clothes. But she was going to miss Paris. She never seemed to get quite enough time in Paris to do everything she wanted. She gazed out the window of the cabriolet in a melancholy state. The cab slowed for another coach, stopped in the lane in front of them, and she stared down an alley. She thought she saw something shiny move in the shadows. She blinked and rubbed her tired eyes. She wasn't imagining it. She leaned slightly out the window. There was a pair of the crawlers tussling in the alley. "Stop the cab! Stop the cab!" She flung open the door of the cab and jumped out even before it had stopped completely. The bustle of the dress made her movements ungainly, and she nearly dumped herself onto her nose. Drake's eyes followed her trajectory and spotted the wrestling automatons. He thrust his bundled coat into Lord Ashley's hands. "Stay here and hold the cab." He leapt out of the cab and followed McTrowell at a sprint. Without the impediment of couture, he caught up to her just as she reached the wrestlers. They were too late to save one of them. The victor snapped off two of the legs of the vanquished and scuttled off down the alley. Drake snatched up the disabled one and held it up for McTrowell to switch off as she had with the first disabled one they had recovered. He set it back down on the ground. "We shall come back for this one." They dashed after the victor. This is exciting. It scuttled around a corner at the end of the alley and threw a hinged flap at the bottom of a much-abused door. Sparky reached for the handle, but Erasmus held an index finger up to his lips. He leaned forward and placed his ear against the door. She followed suit. They could hear muffled voices inside, but it was clear the space behind the door was large and contained many large obstructions, judging by the distortion of the voices. Drake grasped the door handle firmly and gently pushed down on the latch, being especially careful to make as little noise as possible. Fortunately, it was dark in the alley, so they wouldn't let in too much light. They squeezed through, and Erasmus closed the door quietly behind them. Their eyes took a moment to adjust to the light, during which time Sparky realized that Erasmus was actually standing quite close to her. She could feel his warm breath on the back of her neck. When his eyes had adjusted, he tapped her lightly on the shoulder and pointed in the direction of the voices. They inched closer, stopping at the edge of a stack of wooden crates. When they peered around the corner, McTrowell had to slap her hand over her own mouth to keep herself from gasping out loud. Not surprisingly, Mr. Hedgley and Mr. Martin were standing in the middle of the open space. Slightly more surprising was a man neither she nor Drake had seen before. He was little more than a twig of a man with a shock of wild, frizzy brown hair that was not in his eyes only because his eyes were covered by a particularly large and opaque pair of goggles with multiple interchangeable lenses on miniature arms. He looked a bit like a praying mantis. She had an unkind thought about his being devoured, and then she remembered the first part of that scenario and shuddered in revulsion. The sight that had nearly caused her to gasp was a sea of crawlers covering nearly the entirety of the open floor space. The three men were standing around a large work table, and the crawlers completely surrounded them. It looked almost as if the crawlers had herded the men there and were holding them hostage. Mr. Martin kept looking down at his ankles, as if he expected the crawlers to start snapping at him. Mr. Hedgley was unperturbed by the mechanized horde and was considerably exercised by the bugman. He was stabbing his finger at another dismembered crawler lying immobile on the work table. "These bloody things are a lot of work to build and cost dearly. It's your fault they're tearing each other apart. We'll never turn a profit if they keep doing this." "Now, Monsieur Hedgley, do not worry about yourself so much about the money. You will take all the fun out of the experiment." "This isn't a bloody experiment. It's a business. You told me you could make our E-Packs work together as a team. Teammates don't go about ripping each other's legs off. It's not very sportsmanlike. Sensing that his partner was either going to have a seizure or do some violence to their colleague, Mr. Martin interjected himself into the conversation, if somewhat timidly. Well, to be fair, Horace, he did make them work together better. They're a lot easier to control when we don't have to set each one to a single task, but with the good doctor's emergency hive mind. Emergent hive mind, Mr. Hedgley corrected. Yes, well, they do work together better. Right up until one of them decides another one's not towing the line and takes it upon himself to have himself a little swift justice. Hedgley glared at a crawler at the edge of the swarm that was very close to Drake and McTrowell's position. They had to duck back behind the crates before they were spotted. McTrowell realized Hedgley must have been looking at the vicious fratricidal crawler they had followed into the building. She rather imagined that it had beady cold eyes, but she knew she was just anthropomorphizing. Monsieur Hedgley, soon I will perfect the hive mind and the Apex will be fully autonomous. Nothing will be able to stop them! At the sound of excitement in the bugman's voice, the crawlers started humming and hopping back and forth on their sharp metal feet. Oh, this gives me the creeps every time I read it. Making a sound like a swarm of ravenous beetles. McTrowell stepped back in disgust. Right onto the hem of her dress. She choked herself with the high snug collar and let out a gurgling gag. She regained her balance just in time to see the swarm freeze and swivel as one in the direction of their hiding place. Dun dun dun! The three men stopped and looked around as well, and then the bugman let out a squeal so high-pitched it hurt the ears. Neither Drake nor McTrowell needed to wait even a second to know what it meant and that they were in deep trouble. They turned and fled back the direction they came, slamming open the door and pounding up the alley. Stealth was a distant dream. Unencumbered as he was, Drake made better time. It only took him a second to snatch up the disabled crawler in the alley as he sprinted to the cab. Ashley was leaning out the cab window, watching wide-eyed at the pell-mell approach of his friends being chased by an angry swarm of carnivorous devices. With uncharacteristic vigor, Drake shouted, "Drive!" Ashley threw open the door of the cab just in time to catch the dismembered crawler Drake threw to him. Drake dove in immediately after. The cab lurched to a start, making it difficult for the two of them to scramble around into position to grab McTrowell's outstretched arms when she finally made it to the cab. A couple of the crawlers had managed to catch hold of the hem of her dress. Drake and Ashley kicked them loose, and the crawlers took big chunks of the dress with them. Fortunately, the horse needed no encouragement to send it galloping off madly through the streets of Paris, a smart horse, but its flight knocked the three friends into an unceremonious heap on the floor of the cab. They dragged themselves painfully up off the floor and onto the seats, rubbing sore elbows and knees along the way. Sparky held up the ruined hem of the dress. Well, I, for one, am looking forward to a nice, quiet, safe activity like an airship regatta. The cab passed under the elaborate wrought iron archway embellished with Porte du Jean-Marie Joseph Coutel. Well, and there it is, the end of Victor and Vanquished. God, I'm tired just from reading. Okay.
That was fun.
Yes, it was. Well, kids, we are Drake and McTrowell. Thank you for joining us for another chapter of the Bavarian Airship Regatta on Corona Storytime.